How can we be certain that what we know is actually true? This is one of the most fundamental questions in all of philosophy. In 17th century France, a brilliant thinker named Rene Descartes decided to tackle this problem head-on. He wanted to build a new foundation for knowledge, one that was completely unshakable. To do this, he began a radical experiment. He decided to doubt everything he had ever been told. He questioned all the lessons from his childhood, the authority of his teachers, and the books he had read. Descartes was looking for a single, undeniable truth upon which he could build a whole new system of science and understanding. His journey into doubt would become famous in the West, marking a major turning point in the history of thought. What many people in the West don't realize is that this profound journey of doubt had been undertaken centuries earlier. Over 500 years before Descartes, a towering figure in the Islamic world had walked a very similar path. His name was Abu Hamid al Ghazāli. Born in Persia, al Ghazāli was a celebrated scholar and theologian. At the height of his career, he experienced a deep spiritual and intellectual crisis. He looked at the conflicting opinions of different schools of thought and realized he could no longer blindly accept the beliefs he had inherited. Just like Descartes would later do, al Ghazāli decided to strip away all his prior convictions to search for a more solid ground for his faith and knowledge. Both men, separated by half a millennium and vast cultural distances, started from the same place, a profound dissatisfaction with second-hand knowledge. They were not content to simply accept what others told them. Descartes wrote about clearing away the old, unstable foundations of a house to build a new one on solid rock. Similarly, al Ghazāli described his condition as a sickness, a deep-seated skepticism that compelled him to systematically examine his own beliefs. Both thinkers understood that to find true certainty, they first had to embrace total uncertainty. They had to become masters of doubt before they could become seekers of truth, embarking on a lonely and difficult intellectual voyage. This parallel is truly remarkable. Descartes is often hailed as the father of modern philosophy for his method of systematic doubt. Yet al Ghazāli's autobiography, Deliverance from Error, reads like an early blueprint for this very method. He meticulously documents his process of questioning everything, from the claims of theologians to the teachings of other philosophers. He wanted to understand how we acquire knowledge and to distinguish between what is merely opinion and what is absolute certainty. This shared starting point raises fascinating questions about the flow of ideas through history and challenges our conventional understanding of where modern scientific thought truly began. Once they had committed to doubting everything, both Descartes and al Ghazāli turned their critical gaze towards their own senses. How could they trust what their eyes saw, or what their ears heard? Al Ghazāli used a powerful example to illustrate this point. He looked up at the stars and noted that they appeared to be incredibly small, perhaps the size of a coin. However, he knew from astronomical proofs that they were, in fact, enormous bodies, many times larger than the Earth itself. This clear contradiction showed him that his senses were not a reliable source of truth. They could be deceptive, presenting a distorted picture of reality. This led him to conclude that any knowledge based purely on sensory experience was fundamentally untrustworthy. Descartes expressed a very similar line of reasoning. He noted that our senses can easily fool us. A straight stick can appear bent when placed in water. A distant tower that looks round might turn out to be square when we get closer. Since his senses had deceived him in the past, he concluded that it was wise never to trust them completely. For Descartes, this was a crucial step in his method of doubt. If he could not trust the information coming from his own body, then a vast amount of what he thought he knew was suddenly thrown into question. The world as he perceived it might not be the world as it truly is, a deeply unsettling but necessary thought for his philosophical project. The next stage of their doubt was even more profound. They began to question the difference between being awake and being asleep. Al Ghazāli pondered the nature of dreams. While dreaming, he explained, a person believes their dream experiences to be absolutely real. It is only upon waking that they realize it was all an illusion. This led him to ask a radical question. What if our current waking life is just another dream? Perhaps, he suggested, there is another state of being we will enter into after death, which will make our current life seem as unreal as a dream does now. This thought experiment cast doubt not just on his senses, but on the very fabric of his conscious reality. Descartes famously explored this exact same idea. He reflected that he had often been tricked by dreams that felt incredibly vivid and real. He had dreamt of sitting by the fire in his dressing gown, only to wake up and find himself in bed. He realized that there were no certain signs to distinguish waking life from a dream. For all he knew, an evil demon or a powerful trickster could be creating the illusion of the world around him. This potent argument, known as the dream argument, allowed Descartes to doubt even the most basic facts about his existence, such as having a body or being in a specific room. Both philosophers had now reached a state of extreme skepticism, trapped in a prison of their own doubt. Having dismantled every belief they once held, both al Ghazāli and Descartes found themselves in a state of profound intellectual crisis. They had doubted their senses, and even their own conscious reality. So, where could they turn to find a way out of this abyss of uncertainty? For both thinkers, the escape route was through reason and logic. They realized that even if their senses were deceiving them, the truths of mathematics and logic seemed to remain unshakable. Descartes reasoned that whether he was awake or dreaming, 2 plus 3 would always equal 5, and a square would always have 4 sides. These were necessary truths, ideas that were true by definition and did not depend on sensory experience. Al Ghazāli had arrived at a similar conclusion centuries earlier. He called these fundamental principles of logic the first principles or self-evident truths. He argued that it is impossible to believe that something can exist and not exist at the same time, or that one thing can be both new and eternal. These logical certainties provided a solid foothold, a starting point from which to begin rebuilding knowledge. The statement 10 is more than 3 was something he could be sure of, regardless of whether he was dreaming or being deceived by his senses. For both philosophers, the pure, abstract world of logic and reason offered the first glimmer of hope in their quest for absolute truth. However, this reliance on reason alone did not fully satisfy either man. They felt that human reason on its own was still limited and could potentially be flawed. There had to be a higher guarantee. Both al Ghazāli and Descartes ultimately concluded that the final step towards certainty was only possible through a belief in God. For al Ghazāli, his intellectual crisis was resolved not by philosophical argument alone, but by a divine intervention. He wrote that God cast a light into his heart, which was the key to unlocking most knowledge. This divine light restored his faith in the first principles of reason and allowed him to trust his intellect once more. Descartes' argument was more philosophical but led to the same place. He reasoned that the idea of a perfect being, God, could not have come from his own imperfect mind. Therefore, God must exist. And because God is perfect, he would not be a deceiver. A good and perfect God would not have created him with a reasoning mind that was designed to be fundamentally flawed. This divine guarantee allowed Descartes to finally trust his clear and distinct ideas, which he grasped through pure reason. In a fascinating parallel, both a Muslim theologian and a Catholic philosopher found that the ultimate foundation for rational thought and science was, in their view, a benevolent God. The similarities between al Ghazāli's deliverance from error and Descartes' discourse on the method are too numerous and too specific to be easily dismissed as mere coincidence. From the initial decision to doubt all inherited beliefs, to the critique of the senses using similar examples, and the exploration of the dream argument, the intellectual journeys are strikingly parallel. Both end their doubt by appealing first to necessary logical truths, and then, ultimately, to God as the final guarantor of knowledge. This raises an important and intriguing question. Could Descartes have been directly influenced by al Ghazāli's work? It is certainly a plausible idea that deserves more attention than it usually receives. We know that many works by Arab and Persian scholars were translated into Latin and circulated in Europe during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Thinkers like Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, and Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, were widely read and debated in European universities. While a direct Latin translation of Deliverance from Error from Descartes' time has not been found, the ideas within it could have reached him through other channels. Scholars in Spain and Italy were discussing these concepts, and it's possible Descartes encountered them through conversations, lectures, or summaries of al Ghazāli's arguments. The intellectual traffic between the Islamic world and Europe was more extensive than we often assume. This possibility forces us to ask a much bigger and more uncomfortable question. Why is the history of science and philosophy so often told as a purely European story? We learn about a so-called Dark Age in Europe followed by a Renaissance and a scientific revolution, as if these developments happened in a vacuum. The immense contributions of scholars from the Islamic world, who not only preserved ancient Greek knowledge but also made huge original advances in mathematics, medicine, optics, and philosophy, are frequently downplayed or completely ignored. Al Ghazali's deep philosophical inquiry is a perfect example of this forgotten history. By acknowledging figures like Al Ghazali, we don't diminish the genius of thinkers like Descartes. Instead, we get a richer, more accurate, and more interconnected picture of human history. Science and philosophy are not the products of one culture, but a global human endeavor built over centuries by people from all over the world. Recognizing the influence that Islamic philosophers had on the European Renaissance and Enlightenment is not just about correcting the historical record. It is about understanding that the great quest for knowledge has always been a shared journey, and acknowledging all the brilliant minds who helped guide us along the way.